Back in 1972, the Rockefeller Foundation funded a study that's become known as the Mouse Utopia experiment. Something like it was discussed in the film The Matrix when Agent Smith is interrogating Morpheus.
It's a little known fact that the first Matrix was programmed to be an ideal habitat for humans, all needs provided for, but it failed miserably. Your species rejected the code because you're hardwired for pain and suffering. Entire crops of humans died, and we were forced to reconfigure the system.
Behaviorist John B. Calhoun built a mouse paradise with limitless food, where the mice would have everything that they would need.
Utopian conditions of nutrition, comfort, and housing were provided for a potential population of over 3,000 mice.
In just 2 years, 8 mice turned into 2,200 before they succumbed to a mouse apocalypse.
The use of resources became unequal. Although each living unit was identical in structure and opportunities, more food and water was consumed in some areas.
What Calhoun found was, once the population increased to a certain threshold, even though they technically had everything they needed, those who lived in the highly populated areas would become randomly aggressive, violent, and withdrawn.
Violence became prevalent.
Females rarely carried babies to term, and when they did, they hardly cared for them.
The larger the population, the less care a mother gives to her nest and young.
The younger generations would not even attempt to reproduce, but spent all of their time eating and grooming themselves, and ultimately they grew quite dumb.
Other young mice growing into adulthood exhibited an even different type of behavior. Dr. Calhoun called these individuals the beautiful ones. Their time was devoted solely to grooming, eating, and sleeping. They never involved themselves with others, engaged in sex, nor would they fight. All appeared as a beautiful exhibit of the species, with keen, alert eyes and a healthy, well-kept body. These mice, however, could not cope with unusual stimuli. Though they looked inquisitive, they were, in fact, very stupid.
The study was repeated with rats hooked up to electromagnetic sensors in a multi-level high-rise-like structure, with similar results. Though they technically had everything they needed, they lacked purpose. Calhoun said himself that he saw the fate of his mouse population as a metaphor for the potential fate of man. One human experiment of the same vein was Pruitt-Igoe, an urban housing project consisting of 33 11-story apartment buildings on St. Louis's lower north side.
These developments are run by the St. Louis Housing Authority. This is a far cry from the crowded, collapsing tenements that many of these people have known. Here in bright new buildings with spacious grounds, they can live with indoor plumbing, electric lights, fresh plastered walls, and the rest of the conveniences that are expected in the 20th century.
First occupied in 1954, the same year as Calhoun began his mouse studies at NIMH, Pruitt-Igoe was supposed to be a shining solution to overcrowding and to replace the dilapidated mess of poor and working-class slums that had taken over most of St. Louis, when half the industrial base moved away after the war. But there were strings attached. All kinds of regulations and restrictions were put on the Pruitt-Igoe residents. The father of the household was not allowed to live with his own family, and they sent welfare workers around to make sure the men weren't in the apartments. The people were put under total control and became hopelessly dependent. In just 2 years, the urban planning social experiment began to fall apart.
Tried for 3 days to get city and housing authority officials to help remedy the plight.
The disaster that fell on Pruitt-Igoe and
water lines in several of the Pruitt-Igoe apartment buildings broke, and a sewer line is broken.
Maintenance crews to board up an estimated 10,000 broken windows.
All raw sewage bubbles out of the ground like a malevolent spray.
Breakdown of services.
Clean up the mess, and no one ever showed.
You need, first of all, to have this area declared as a disaster area and an emergency area.
We're not no dogs, cats, or rats that you can just take us and just put us just anywhere. We want some decent place where we can live.
The sense that the housing project was also an experimental laboratory was literally in the air. It came out decades later that during the 1950s and 60s, Pruitt-Igoe was even the subject of top-secret chemical warfare tests conducted by the U.S. military, who sprayed a zinc-cadmium sulfide aerosol containing radioactive material over the low-income housing area to assess its effects.
The Department of Defense has assigned primary responsibility to the Chemical Corps, U.S. Army, for basic research in biological and chemical agents.
Reports of links to cancer have surfaced, but have never been causally linked. Of course, the Army insisted it was harmless. Just like in the Mouse Utopia experiment, violent gangs took over.
Within a few years, the place had been ripped apart by its unimproved tenants. Old and middle-aged people were scared to live there, and the young were in the corridors with flick knives.
It devolved into total chaos, vandalism, and squalor, to the point that residents lived in fear, and police and firemen refused to go to Pruitt-Igoe even during the day. The buildings were finally demolished beginning in 1972, the same year Calhoun's Mouse Utopia devolved into extinction. So the elites running the show realized that ultimately, the utopia of universal basic income might look nice on paper, but it won't work.
To enjoy your work, you'll need to find in it more than money. You'll need personal satisfaction, pride of accomplishment, a sense of importance to others.
The masses become shiftless, depressed, angry, and antisocial. And maybe the elite are fine with that. But they're centralizing power anyway in preparation for return to feudalism, the oligarchical collectivism coming our way, where we're all hamsters in a cage living on a dole managed from a highly centralized, militarized government above. All of this ties back to eugenics. The elite have manufactured a future that is only meant for a select few.
The population